Okay, this week's Torah portion, as we spoke about before, is Parshat Shalach, about the spies. Well, the Haftorah of this week's Torah portion is also talking about spies, but it's a little bit different. It happened after the 40 years, about 40 years after Moses sent his spies, which was a tremendous disaster, as Joshua also sent spies. Joshua, before they went into the land of Israel, Joshua sent 2 spies, and that was successful. And we're going to see that there's a big difference between the 2 of them. And from this difference between the 2 of them, we're going to learn something very, very deep and vital, important for us and our attitude toward life in general and toward God and ourselves. So let's go. This is one of the speeches that the Rebbe, this is a speech that the Rebbe said in Tammuz Tav Shin Nun Aleph, 1991. My pointer over here. We have spoken many times about the difference, in the how the Torah was divided. The Parshat, the Shavua, was divided into these 52, 53 Torah portions. Sha'av Shabakol Shabbos, even that every Shabbat we read one of the 53 parshas of the Torah, and every day of that week we read 1/7 of that Torah portion relevant to that particular week and relevant to that day. Nevertheless, every Torah section, every Torah reading for that week, and every detail of it connects to the whole entire Torah. From Bereshit until Ana Yisrael, from the very beginning to the end. And sometimes you get so involved on the details, you forget about the generality. Shehi Kalash, like they say, you don't see the forest because of the trees. Shehi Kalash and Akasu b'Parshateinu Torah Achad, because the Torah is one Torah. So you can look at the Torah and you can forget that it's given by God. You can get so involved in the details and forget the miraculousness of the Torah and also the general message of the whole Torah in general. For instance, Parsha Achad, Shekol Chelek Shabbat, just like in each and every Torah portion. From this week, we're learning Shlach, that every detail which is in this Torah portion is attached to the whole general idea of that Torah reading. So everything in this Torah reading has something to do with the spies and going into the land of Israel and etc. Kamudgash B'Kriyas Yom Shabbos. That's what we read on Shabbat. We read the whole entire Torah portion in the congregation. This especially is in this week Shlach. What happens in this week's Torah portion, Shlach? Parsha Shlach, this Torah portion that we're reading, talks about mostly about the spies, the scouts. It begins how Moses sent these 12 scouts from the beginning of the Torah portion. That's the whole entire first reading in this week's Torah portion. How they went, how they came back, what they said to Moses, what they said to Aaron, and all of the details of that happened in this whole thing. They went, what they saw in the land of Israel, they came back, they told everybody. Everybody replied, they said, we don't want to go into the land of Israel. Out of Onish and Moses, then again, God said they're going to get a punishment. That takes up the first 5 readings, 5 portions of this week's Torah reading. Also, afterwards, it talks about the Nesachim. Afterwards, it talks about what's called the wine libations. Every day when they came, when they would sacrifice on the altar, so there was a special, like a sort of a funnel on the side, and they would pour wine there every morning. That started when they came to the Kitavon, when they came into the land of Israel. and you make a sacrifice to God, then you have to bring wine for what's called the Nesach. In other words, what's that telling us? That even though the Jewish people sinned, and there was a decree on them that they would not go into the land of Israel, but God told them that they would go, their next generation would go into the land of Israel. This is one long story. If so, the whole entire thing is one big long story about sending in the scouts coming back, the Jewish people refusing, God getting angry, announcing to them they weren't going to go to the land of Israel. And then after that, telling them that the next generation would go in and they would make these wine offerings and etc. And in order to understand this, it's not just enough to learn one, you have to learn the whole entire thing. You have to learn all of it from the beginning until the end. It's like watching a movie. You ever watch a movie? You just watch the beginning, the middle. It doesn't tell you anything. You don't know what's going to happen. Just watch the end. It's not exciting. You watch the whole entire thing, like the Havdil, to separate between them, the holy and not holy. But you watch the whole thing, you get an idea. The same thing with the Torah, at least the Torah, every Torah portion. But and even more. Then in the end of this week's Torah portion, and everything goes after the end, there is the commandment of tzitzit. The commandment of tzitzit are these strings, which are attached to the end of four-cornered garments. That even though the tzitzit, the commandment of tzitzit, is an individual commandment, one of the 613 commandments of the Torah, but nevertheless it says that this commandment of tzitzit is shekula keneged kol mitzvot, is equal to all the other commandments. Now, what is this commandment of tzitzit? It says that if a male Jew over the age of 13, if he wants to put on a garment that has four corners or more, then he has to put on four of the corners, he has to put what's called these strings, which are called tzitzit, and they're tied in a special way, not that difficult, that they are tied in a special way, and that they hang from the corners of the garments. There's a special blessing you make on it. So it said, but this commandment, even though it's just one of the 613 commandments, but in some way it includes all of the other ones. How so? It says, that's what's at the end of this week's Torah reading. The end. This commandment of tzitzit. It says by tzitzit that if you should look at them and remember all the commandments of God. Why? Because the number of the word tzitzit is 600. Tzadik Yud, that's 90 and 10. That's 100. Tzadik Yud is another 100, 200. Tuf is 400. That's 400. The Shmona Chutim, and this 8 strings that you put on, it's really 4 strings, but you divide them, you fold them over into 2. So it ends 8 strings. The Chamesha Kasharim, and when you tie them to the special way of tying them, there's 5 knots. So it comes out to be altogether 613. Right? 600 is the Gematria Tzitzis, 8 strings, 5 knots, that's 13, 613. That's the number of commandments there are. Dugmas of a Torah, Shekolin Parsha B'Torah, just like the Torah, that every section of the Torah is attached to everything else in the Torah, all tied together. Kivin Torah Kula is Torah Chas, Tzitzit, that reminds you of the Torah because Tzitzit are all tied together, and it hints at 613 commandments. And so that hints also at the idea of the Torah, that everything in the Torah is tied with everything else in the Torah. Says the Rebbe, Tzorach Laban, we have to understand, Kivit Shkolin in the Torah, since everything in the Torah is exact, Mistaber Lomar, it's very probable to say, Shehad Gashat Inyan Achdut, yet the idea of unity in the Torah, in Parsha Shlach, that if in Parsha Shalach it has this thing of tzitzit, which show the unity, the tying together of everything, and so this idea of tying the whole Torah together, the Torah is one unit, which is hinted at by tzitzit, and because it appears in this week's Torah portion Shalach, so this has to have some sort of a connection, especially with this Torah portion of Shalach. So somehow or other, this idea of the spies, the scouts, refusing to go into the land of Israel, making a lot of trouble for themselves and for Moshe and getting God really angry, somehow or other, this is a big hint at the unity of the Torah. The Torah is all one unit, just like tzitzis are. How can that be? I mean, this Torah portion talking about the sending the scouts is the opposite. Everybody didn't do what God wants. And the whole thing of the Torah is to do what God wants. How is it that doing what God wants, hinted at in Tzitzit, is found in the Torah portion, which is the opposite of what God wants? Okay. Hakesher b'sheichos l'zman shabo korim b'Torah parsha shalach. This is at the end of the month of Sivan. When do we read it? Everything is attached to everything else. When are we reading this Torah portion of Shalach? At the end of the month of Sivan. That's this month. Like we're going to learn later on. We should explain first. Let's delve into this a little bit. What exactly was these scouts that Moses sent? And also later on, the scouts in our Haftorah that Joshua sent. Whether in this Torah portion, I share that, even though this is the topic of this Torah portion, that it talks about sending the spies by means of, our Torah portion talks about sending the spies by means of Moses, and the Haftorah is something like, it says when they made the Haftorah, they made it similar to the Torah. What is the Haftorah? Haftorah is a portion usually taken from the prophets or whatever. Here it's not. Here it's taken from the book of Joshua. Taken from something other than the 5 books of Moses. And it's a little thing that's read, sometimes it'll take 5-10 minutes. It's read in the Torah after the regular reading. After the regular reading, every week there's a Torah portion that's read. After that is read what's called the Haftorah. And this Haftorah always has some similar topic or content to the Torah portion. So same thing over here. Our Torah portion is talking about Moses sending the spies. And the Haftorah, which is about the same subject, is talking about Joshua, that he sent also 2 spies. It says, but there's a big difference between them. A big difference between them. How can you say the same thing? There's a lot of difference. What's the difference? Number one, the Rebbe is going to have 5 differences? 6 differences. 6 differences. Where is it? Number one, Meraglim, in the scouts that Moses sent. Ne'emar, it says, Shalach lacha. God said to Moses, you send. If you want to, you do it. But first, Rashi said, that Rashi explains the simple meaning of the Torah, L'datcha. You do it according to your, this is your call, Moses. Ani eni mitzvah b'lecha. I'm not commanding you. Im tirtzeh shlach. If you want to, send. Which is not the case. The spies of Joshua, Bavare said Joshua b'dato. Joshua certainly did not do anything on his own. God must have commanded him. Joshua would not have sent spies on his own. He saw what happened when Moses did it. So it must be that God told him to send spies. Now, just one small thing. What happened? What is the whole story over here? Joshua sends in 2 spies. And he tells them just to go to the city of Jericho. And they go to the city of Jericho, and they don't even spy out Jericho. Immediately, they know that they're going to get caught. And this lady, Rachav, she lowers down a rope. She lets them in. She lets them in. She hides them because they're looking for them. Hides them, and they escape. And she says, listen, I know you Jews are going to conquer the whole country. When you do, spare me and my family. They say, okay. And she actually got married to Joshua. And Joshua was one of the, I'm not sorry, to Joshua. Okay, we'll talk about that. She got married to Joshua. Joshua sent the spies. Okay, so that's what happened in the spies that Moses sent. They took 40 days. They went and they surveyed the whole land of Israel. Nobody tried. They didn't try to hide themselves. They didn't hide themselves whatsoever. And they came back, and there was a terrible tragedy. They said we shouldn't go in. And the two spies that Joshua sent, which is 40 years later, they went in. They did not survey the land of Israel. They were sent only to survey Jericho, and they didn't really survey Jericho either. And they came back, and they succeeded. Everybody said okay, and they went in. So we're going to see this. This is some of the differences. Okay, number one difference. We have 6 differences. First of all, Moses sent from his own initiative. Moses said, I'm going to send the spies in. What do you say, God? God said, okay, if you want to, you can do it. I'm not commanding you. Joshua, on the other hand, he would not have done it on his own. Obviously, he must have had the commandment of God. Can move on like it's understood. And also, we have to explain this in the Torah. The simple, we can get it from the words also. That after that Moses sent and the spies, and there was a disaster from Moses because Moses sent it on his own initiative. Joshua would not have done the same mistake again and sent the spies on his own initiative. Therefore, we have to say that God commanded him. Difference number one, God did not command Moses, God did command Joshua. Difference number two. In Moses, it says, Shlach lecha anashim, anashim davka lo meraglim. It says, send people. It doesn't say send scouts. V'yaturu et eretz Canaan, and they should scout out the land of Israel. It didn't say v'yachparu v'yiraglu. It didn't say to spy out the land of Israel. The word spies is an improper word. These were scouts. They came to survey the land. In Joshua, it says anashim meraglim. And Joshua, it says clearly that he sent spies, lachfor et ha'oretz, in order to spy out the land of Israel. Lachfor et eretz bo. Says later on, it says they came in order to, how do you say, to undermine the land of the settlers of Israel. So Moses, he sent them. It says he didn't call them spies. By Joshua, they're called spies. Gimel. In the spies of Moses, it says ishachad mate avutav yishlachu. By Moses, it says he sent 12 important people, each one to represent his own tribe. By Joshua, he said Joshua only sent 2 people. 2 people to represent everything. By Moses, each person represented his own tribe. They had their own tribe in interest. Right? They knew what. By Joshua, only sent 2 people. Difference number 4. The spies of Moses, they were Nisiei Yisrael. They were important people. Call Nasi Bayam, Rosh Bnei Yisrael Ema. They were the heads of the Jewish people. And it tells all their names, what they are. Shamua ben Zakur, etc. The Ilu Meraglim, but by the spies that Joshua sent in, it says he sent in 2 people, and it doesn't say who they are. Who are the 2 people? Right? Other places it says that it was Kalev. Here, you can look in this note over here. It says Pinchas and Kalev. They went in. Pinchas and Kalev, they were the 2 spies. But it doesn't say that clearly in the Torah. Okay, that was number 4. 5. Shliach HaMeraglim, that Moses sent his spies out in an advertised way, whether regarding the Jewish people, that everybody knew, all the Jewish people knew that he sent these spies. And when they came back, he said, we have come back with the word, right, to speak to everyone. Or also even the people of Israel, the Canaanites that were living in Israel, right, that were living in Israel at that time, they knew. Shahari HaMeraglim, the spies, they didn't make any effort to hide themselves, so that they shouldn't be felt. And by means of this, it says, Kol echad mehem yelech levado, right? It could be, right, maybe each one they should have spread out. Spread out. Everyone would go, and there was 12 tribes, and everyone would go and scout out his own place. It would save time also. Elahochu, they all went together in a way that was very, very obvious to everyone. Acha Yitzhak HaKadosh Baruch Hu got it to make a miracle. Shalo Yasimu Aleim, the people wouldn't notice them. But Kol Makom She'avru, it says every place that they went, it says that the Canaanites were burying their dead. Why? All of a sudden, there was a big corona over there. Who knows what happened? And everybody died. And the God made a thing with people were burying their dead. Kedei latridam be'avlam v'lo yitnu lev le'elu, so that the Canaanites would be occupied in their mourning and their misery, and they wouldn't notice these. And it says later on that the spies, when they came back, it says that we heard the people saying, "Look at those little grasshoppers dancing. These little people. What is this?" Which is not the case. So the spies of Moses, they went, how do you say, revealed, which is not the case. The spies of Joshua, it says clearly, Maraglim Chirish, that he sent them to be quiet. Whether in regard to the Jewish people that Joshua sent them quietly, nobody knew about it. And also, not like Moses. Moses sent it was a big fanfare, send them off, right? It was amazing. Everybody was happy. By the spies of Joshua, he didn't let anybody know. He sent them quietly, and also the people he told them to go and to conceal themselves, camouflage themselves. And therefore, when they came back, it says, "Vayavo el Yoshua." They just went to Joshua, and they told him, "Vayomer el Yoshua." They didn't speak to all the Jewish people. And also the people in the land of Israel, the Canaanites. It says, "Asu atzmechem kecharashim." Make yourselves like you're very hadis, like your shaloya stiru divreim mipenechem. Make yourself like I said, like you're deaf. Don't react to what you hear the people saying. In other words, just go in, scout out. Don't pay any attention to anyone. Don't look around. That's what it means. Davar acher cherish cheres. Not just to make yourself deaf, make yourself like pieces of clay. Because make yourself so that you seem like pieces of camouflage yourself, these two, so that you won't be noticed. Until the time they were there, they had to hide so that the people wouldn't see them. But what Rachav hid them. Like it says, Vatika Chaisha et Shnei Anashim, that this woman, she took the two men, and she hid them. And they said, and afterwards, when the night fell or whatever, she said, run to the mountains, pen yivgo v'chem harodfim, because there's people running after you, etc. And finally, the last difference between Moses and the spies of Moses, the scouts of Moses, and the spies of Joshua, Hamaraglim, the scouts that Moses sent out, Hochu b'gavul, they went. They covered the whole land of Israel. Arba meot parsa, 400 parsas on 400 parsas. A parsa is like 2 miles or something. 800 miles on 800 miles. Meshech arba yom. They took 40 days. They scouted out the whole entire land of Israel. But the spies of Joshua, that it says even though that Joshua said to them, go and see the land and Jericho, and not just Jericho, but also Joshua said to them, see the land. But the fact of the matter is they didn't do it. Not only did they not see the land, they went into Jericho alone, below the Sharchel, it's not the rest of the land. And even more, Shafilu at Jericho, even Jericho itself, they didn't really see. The same night that they got to the house of this woman, Rachav, as Haridatem Rachav be'arachalon. She hid them for a while, and then she let them escape through this window, Shebekira Choma, which is on the wall on outside of the city. Jericho was on the boundary of Israel, so it had a big thick wall, and she lived, and her house was in this wall. So she let them out, so they were outside of the city, they were outside of the boundaries. She said, run to the mountains. So sit there for 3 days because the people are running after you and they'll get you. And immediately they ran to Joshua, the shlichus, so they didn't really go and see anything. They were just there for like one night. That's all they were in Jericho. So if so, there's a lot of differences between the spies of Joshua and the spies of Moses to the degree that they're almost not similar at all. How do we explain it? The answer is that what the Meraglim of Moshe did and Joshua, they were different things. Why were they joining together? Because they had one purpose. And the purpose was to take over the land of Israel. And what the Rebbe is going to say is that Moses sent the spies just like to his spies, just to survey the land because they were sure they were going to take it over. Moses was sure, just to survey the land, to come back with a good report and everybody. And Joshua sent them in order to spy out the land, in order to conquer it. But we'll see that, God willing, tomorrow. Okay. What the lesson that we can learn from it, very, very deep, beautiful lesson. We'll learn that, God willing, also. Now let's learn the Yom Yom. 1 minute. The Yom Yom. The Tzemach Tzedek, the third Rebbe of Chabad, he composed a lot of songs. He studied Torah aloud and he would sing. Sometimes he would interrupt his studies or write him Chassidut and he would sing a melody. My grandfather said that from the sound of his melody, you could tell what subject he was then occupied in learning in Torah. Have a good day. God willing, 3 o'clock, we'll learn the Torah portion with commentary and we'll learn Pirkei Avot, God willing.